Hey everybody, this is the second lecture on the causes and effects of Reconstruction. Last time that we talked, we learned about Andrew Johnson's presidency, which from 1865 to 1865 was the first part of the Reconstruction of the United States after the Civil War. Today we're going to learn about President Grant's causes and effects of Reconstruction, some of the things that went on. And this will bring us to the end of the Reconstruction era. So we're going to basically divide up learning about President Grant into three learning tasks. And so the first one is we want to learn about how businessmen became even more powerful during Grant's presidency and look at a couple of examples of that. We want to talk about how this era was a really tough time for minorities and labor, and also farmers included in that labor, not just people who go to factory jobs. And then the third objective or task, learning task, is all about corruption during President Grant's term. So let's get started as I talk you through some of these topics. First, I want to go back to the very front of this presentation and show you this image on the back. This is the political cartoon that was created to represent Standard Oil, and you can see that here on the top of this oil bucket. It says Standard Oil, and the octopus is supposed to represent John D. Rockefeller, who was the founder of Standard Oil, and the octopus is supposed to represent his tentacles reaching out and controlling all different parts of the economy. And if you could see this cartoon, you could see all of it. You could see that at the end of these tentacles, he's got some congressmen in his grasp. He's got some buildings such as the Capitol building and the White House in his grasp. And the whole point of the cartoon is to show people through art how the businessman is becoming so powerful during the Gilded Age. And the Gilded Age is the era that follows the Reconstruction era, and that will be the next part of history that we're going to learn about. So this is a really famous cartoon, and you can see here at the bottom, you see these congressmen in the grasp of Rockefeller. You see his menacing eyes here. You can see him behind the causes and effects of Reconstruction. And so one of the characteristics of this era is the rise of powerful businessmen. We talked about how in the last PowerPoint how the United States after the Civil War is really destroyed. There's all kinds of roads that have been destroyed, bridges, people can't travel, people have lost their money, they're on a lot of jobs, there are a lot of injured soldiers. We're trying to put the government back together. The Congress can't get along, the president can't get along with the Congress, and it's just a really, really terrible time. And so one of the goals of the Reconstruction era was rebuilding not just the government, but also rebuilding the nation's infrastructure. And by infrastructure, we mean bridges, roads, all those types of things. So the powerful businessmen come forward, and the government really kind of turns the other way and just lets the businessman do what he needs to do to get the economy going. And so during this time, one of the biggest things that happens as far as rebuilding infrastructure and creating trade and travel is the building of the first transcontinental railroad. And this was a symbolic act for the nation. By connecting the nation from coast to coast with the railroads, it was like reuniting the nation, not just figuratively, but literally through the Transcontinental Railroad. And so that was a huge construction project, uniting the nation, made it possible for people to move out west. People could get the goods that they needed, people could travel. And like I said, it was a very, very symbolic gesture. Businessmen were relied on to make this happen. They had the money, they had the capital, and they had the management skills. And so I like to always point my students to fun things that they can watch on TV. There's a series called Hell on Wheels, which is a series that used to come on the TV, and I think it's on Netflix now, but it's all about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad and how people went out west to get a new life and start over after the Civil War. So that's a really neat show if you want to check it out. Standard Oil, as I said before, is the company founded by John D. Rockefeller. He will become the poster child of the rich businessman at this time who develops a company that is so big and far-reaching, it in fact becomes a monopoly on our nation, and it becomes so powerful, so overreaching, that people actually kind of begin to turn against John D. Rockefeller. And he is one of these many businessmen that we're going to learn about in the Gilded Age, who become fabulously wealthy, have lots of control, they can influence Congress, they can get laws passed that benefit them. And it's just going to become an era of the businessmen basically being in control and influencing the government to a great degree. Another issue or task, learning task we want to take on in this era with Grant and the Reconstruction era is the minorities as they struggle, and labor forces, farmers and people who work in factories. So one of the things that was passed, one of the laws passed during this era is the 15th Amendment. 15th Amendment was intended to give African Americans more control, more say, more political power in the government, because it gave them the right to vote. However, as we learned in our last lesson with Andrew Johnson, the KKK will use terror to intimidate African Americans and keep them from using this vote to give themselves political power and say. Also, during this time, as we expand west, we're going to see more and more warfare between Native American groups and American military and settlers as we expand west. And so some of the big events in this era of many, many wars between Native Americans, there are several major events that occur that are turning points in Native American history. And these set of conflicts going from 1876 forward are called the Sioux Wars. So one of the major events is the Battle of Little Bighorn. This is probably, in my mind, it's the most important victory of Native Americans against U.S. military. This is where General Custer's men are defeated. It is a major shock to the American military when this happens. Also, during this period, we have what's called the Ghost Dance, which is a revival of Native American culture, where you have leaders in Native American society who coming forward and asking people not to be dependent upon trade, to get back to their roots, to protect their culture, and to not rely on different products like alcohol, and to basically turn from what they would consider to be a very destructive lifestyle. Then also another major event is the massacre at Wounded Knee. This is an event that occurs during this era in which some Native Americans on a reservation, the U.S. military goes there, attempts to move them to another location. A shot is fired, and I think about 200 Native Americans were killed, shot down by the U.S. military. And this turns out to be just a terrible, terrible event in Native American culture. It will break the spirit of many Native Americans fighting. Some will continue to fight on, but from this point forward, the situation for Native Americans just continues to get worse and worse. Also, during this period is a great time of corruption. I always like to tell my students that after a period of warfare, there is usually a period of corruption. And this is due to the fact that in a time of war, the government is very controlling. The government has to control money, labor, resources during a time of war. And after the war is over, the government will all of a sudden let go of the controls. When this happens, a lot of corruption seems to follow because the government just basically isn't paying attention to what's going on. Also, during this era of rebuilding after the war, and after every war we always go through a rebuilding period, whether it's a real rebuilding of roads and infrastructure, or if it includes just rebuilding the nation, rebuilding culture, attitudes, confidence in the government. During this rebuilding time, there will be a lot of people who will come forward and take advantage of that. There's a lot of money that the government allocates or sends out to rebuild this infrastructure, to build roads and suburbs and all types of things. And people tended to be a little bit corrupt. So here are some of the examples of corruption. We're going to learn about these as we go through our activities in the lesson. We have Boss Tweed. He is the most famous, I think, politician in New York City. He leads a ring of corrupt businessmen, corrupt politicians called the Tweed Ring, and they basically enrich themselves by awarding themselves contracts and giving themselves paybacks and controlling the votes. The credit mobilier scandal will occur with the Transcontinental Railroad, and there will be an embezzling scheme called the Whiskey Ring, and also an Indian ring that will take supplies that were intended for Native Americans living on reservations and sell them for profit. So as you can see from this era, there are several scandals. The Fisk and Gould scandal, which is a scandal having to do with gold. And then all of these scandals will unfortunately result in an economic panic of 1873 in which the government, its lack of controls and the economic problems will lead to loss of jobs, lots of people having lost their money in the banks, and all kinds of problems. So that is our lesson on the President Grant administration and our 3 tasks that we're going to look at. And we hope to see you in the next lecture. And let me know if you have questions.